The summer of 1944. Warsaw stood frozen in anxious anticipation. 5 years of German occupation had transformed the once flourishing Polish capital into a city of fear and hope. In the east, the guns of the Red Army roared, approaching the outskirts of the Polish capital. Radios, hidden in basements, broadcast reports of the rapid advance of Soviet troops. Varsovians, with bated breath, caught every message. The front was already on the Vistula River, just a few kilometers from the city. In the shadows of majestic buildings, many of which bore the scars of the bombings of '39, an underground resistance operated. The Home Army, loyal to the Polish government in exile, was preparing for the decisive moment. Weapons, collected bit by bit, secret ammunition caches, city maps with marked strategic targets, everything was ready for the uprising. German patrols on the streets became increasingly nervous. The curfew was enforced with particular brutality. The Gauleiter of Warsaw, Ludwig Fischer, issued an order for the mobilization of 100,000 Poles to build fortifications against the advancing Soviet troops. This order was the last straw. The leadership of the Home Army understood. The time had come. In July of '44, the command of the Home Army made a decision that changed the fate of Warsaw. The plan for Operation Tempest envisioned an uprising at the moment of the German troops' retreat before the advancing Red Army. General Tadeusz Bohr-Komorowski and his staff counted on the element of surprise and a short period of anarchy, when some occupiers were leaving and others had not yet entered the city. The strategy of the uprising was built on 3 pillars. Firstly, the swift capture of key infrastructure objects, bridges over the Vistula, power stations, railway stations, and administrative buildings. Secondly, holding these positions until the arrival of Soviet troops. Thirdly, and this was the most important, demonstrating to the world that Poland was liberating itself. The political calculation was no less important than the military one. The Polish government in exile sought to assert its right to power in post-war Poland, preempting the pro-Soviet Lublin government. Warsaw was to meet the Red Army as mistress in her own home, not as a rescued victim. The Home Army numbered around 25,000 fighters in Warsaw. Most of them had no combat experience: students, civil servants, workers. There was a catastrophic shortage of weapons. For every 10th person there was a rifle. For every 100th, a pistol. The rest had to make do with Molotov cocktails and homemade grenades. The command expected to capture German arsenals in the first hours of the uprising. Hopes for Western allies were great. Radio messages to London contained requests for air deliveries of weapons and ammunition. Polish RAF pilots were preparing for dangerous flights over occupied territory. However, the distance from Italian bases to Warsaw and back was 2,800 kilometers, at the limit of the bombers' capabilities of that time. Expectations regarding the actions of Soviet troops were contradictory. On the one hand, their approach was a necessary condition for the success of the uprising. On the other hand, Poles still had fresh memories of September 17, 39, when Soviet troops entered eastern Poland according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. August 1, 1944. Exactly at 5 o'clock in the evening, Warsaw exploded with gunshots and blasts. Hour _0_, the hour of the uprising, had arrived. Young fighters of the Home Army, yesterday's students and school children, emerged from underground shelters onto the city streets. From the rooftops of buildings and the windows of apartments, scattered rifle shots rang out. Somewhere, machine guns, seized from the Germans in the first minutes of the attack, chattered. The first day brought unexpected success. the insurgents captured the power station in the Powiśla district, the telephone exchange building, and the complex of buildings of the main post office. By nightfall, entire districts, Stare Miasto, Wola, a large part of Śródmieście and Żoliborz, were under the control of the rebels. Polish white and red flags flew over the liberated quarters. Euphoria reigned in the streets. For the first time in 5 years of occupation, Warsawians could openly speak Polish, sing national songs without fear of patrols. However, not everything went according to plan. Key objectives, bridges over the Vistula, the airfield, railway stations, remained in German hands. They also failed to capture the main German strongholds, the Gestapo building on Sucha Avenue, the complex of government buildings in the Saxon Garden area, and the SS barracks on Rakowiecka Street. The second and third days of the uprising brought new successes. The insurgents captured German arms depots on Stocky Street, where they discovered hundreds of rifles, dozens of machine guns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. In the Wola district, the Gęsiówka concentration camp, where Jews from various European countries were held, was liberated. About 300 liberated prisoners immediately joined the rebels, forming a detachment named after Barak Yoselowitz. The city transformed before their eyes. Posters and announcements of the insurgent administration appeared on the walls of houses. Field hospitals and food distribution points began operating. A communication system emerged between districts. Young couriers, often teenage girls, made their way through sewer collectors, carrying reports and orders. Warsawians massively supported the uprising. Thousands of volunteers enlisted in the home army units. Those who could not fight helped build barricades, cared for the wounded, and shared food supplies. The city breathed with a unified spirit of struggle. The German command was initially paralyzed by the suddenness of the strike. The Warsaw garrison numbered only about 13,000 soldiers, scattered throughout the city. Many German units found themselves cut off from each other in their barracks and strongholds. On August 4th, the Bliskowice radio station, the insurgents' transmitter, went on air with its first broadcast. "Attention! This is Warsaw speaking. Soldiers of freedom salute you." These words were heard throughout Poland and far beyond its borders. It seemed that victory was near. On August 6th, a man arrived in Warsaw whose name instilled terror even in hardened Wehrmacht officers. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, personally flew in to assess the situation and take decisive action. After a brief meeting with the command, he uttered a phrase that sealed the city's fate. __0_. To lead the operation to suppress the uprising, SS-Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, a specialist in anti-guerrilla warfare, was appointed. Under his command, a veritable army of punishers was assembled. The Rheinefarth Battle Group, the SS_1_, regiment, consisting of criminals and psychopaths. Bronislaw Kamiński's Rona Brigade, an Azerbaijani battalion, and other units infamous for their brutality. The German tactics were simple and ruthless. First, massive artillery shelling and aerial bombardment. Then, an infantry advance covered by tanks and self-propelled guns. And finally, a methodical clearing of captured blocks, house by house, floor by floor, room by room. On August 8th and 9th, the Germans struck a devastating blow to the Wola district. Here, one of the most terrible war crimes of the Second World War occurred. By order of Bach-Zelewski, the punishers exterminated all residents, regardless of age or gender. People were led out of basements and shot in groups in courtyards, parks, and vacant lots. In 2 days, about 40,000 civilians died in Wola. The Dirlewanger men used living people as shields, forcing them to walk in front of German tanks. Kaminski's fighters turned looting and violence into a system that provoked outrage even among German officers. Later, Kaminski himself was shot by order of the German command for uncontrolled atrocities and looting. The Germans used heavy artillery, including the 600mm Karl mortar, capable of destroying an entire building with a single shell. From the air, the city was bombed by Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and He-111 bombers. Tanks and flamethrower units were used against rebel barricades. By mid-August, German tactics had changed. Bach-Zelewski, realizing that mass killings only intensified resistance, ordered an end to the shootings of civilians. Now they were evicted from the city, with men sent to concentration camps and women and children to a transit camp in Pruszcz. However, the methods of warfare remained the same. Block by block, the Germans turned Warsaw into ruins. Warsaw became a battlefield where every house turned into a fortress and every street into a front line. The insurgents, understanding that they were confronting superior enemy forces, developed a unique system of urban defense that later became a model of guerrilla warfare in a metropolis. The basis of their tactics was the use of underground Warsaw. Sewer collectors, technical tunnels, and basements formed a true underground city. Guides, who knew this network like the back of their hand, led insurgent detachments under German positions, ensuring surprise attacks and safe retreats. Sewer workers played a special role, creating detailed maps of the underground communications. Couriers, many of whom were teenagers, traversed kilometers of foul-smelling tunnels, delivering orders, medications, and ammunition between isolated resistance areas. On the surface, the city transformed into a labyrinth of barricades. They were erected from everything at hand: sandbags, dismantled cobblestones, overturned tramcars, furniture from abandoned apartments. Barricades with trap passages proved particularly effective, luring German infantry into crossfire. Engineering units of the Home Army created complex fortification systems with several lines of defense, allowing for retreats with minimal losses. Urban combat required special weapons. The insurgents organized the production of improvised explosive devices in underground workshops. The famous Filipinki hand grenades, named after their creator, Engineer Philip, became a formidable weapon against tanks. Thousands of Molotov cocktails were made, turning any fighter into an anti-tank asset. Battalion Zoska commander Richard Bialus, known by the pseudonym Grzmot, Thunder, developed the bee swarm tactic. Sudden attacks by small groups from different directions, preventing the enemy from concentrating firepower. In mid-August, his fighters liberated the Genshuvka camp, saving hundreds of prisoners, many of whom immediately joined the uprising. In the Old Town district, Captain Vladislav Okoński, Papa, commander of the barricade on Kilinskiego Street, became a legend. With only 12 fighters and 1 machine gun, he held the position for 2 weeks against vastly superior enemy forces, repelling up to 5 attacks a day. When the Germans finally broke through, they found 3 15-year-old boys and 2 female medics among the defenders. As the fighting progressed, the insurgents' tactics evolved. While frontal attacks and territorial holding predominated at the beginning of the uprising, later the emphasis shifted to mobile defense. Home Army fighters learned to move across rooftops and through attics, breaking passages in walls between buildings. This allowed them to appear suddenly in the enemy's rear and disappear just as suddenly. By August 1944, the Red Army was rapidly approaching Warsaw. The First Belarusian Front, under the command of Marshal Konstantin Rokossovski, reached the eastern bank of the Vistula. From observation posts, Soviet officers could view the panorama of the Polish capital through binoculars. It seemed that one more push, and the city would be liberated. But this push did not follow. Soviet troops stopped, occupying the Warsaw suburb of Praga, and went no further. The decision to halt the offensive was made at the highest level. Joseph Stalin, upon receiving reports of the start of the uprising in Warsaw, held an emergency meeting with members of the State Defense Committee. The official position of the Soviet leadership was clearly formulated. The troops were halted for regrouping after a prolonged offensive that had stretched communications and exhausted resources. However, political calculations lay hidden behind the military arguments. Stalin understood perfectly well that the uprising was organized by the Home Army, the armed forces of the Polish government in exile based in London. The Soviet Union did not recognize this government, having placed its bet on the pro-Soviet Polish Committee of National Liberation in Lublin. The Soviet General Staff presented Stalin with convincing arguments against an immediate assault on Warsaw. The Germans had moved fresh SS Panzer divisions to the city. The supply lines of the Soviet troops stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The flanks of the advancing armies were exposed to enemy counterattacks. All of this made continuing the offensive risky from a military point of view. But there was another side to the coin. The halt on the Vistula allowed several political objectives to be achieved at once. Firstly, to give the Germans the opportunity to defeat the Home Army, a potential opponent to the Sovietization of Poland. Secondly, to demonstrate to the Poles that without the Red Army, they were helpless in the face of the Nazis. Thirdly, to gain time to strengthen the position of the Lublin Committee as the only legitimate authority in the liberated areas of the country. Officially, Moscow declared support for the insurgents. Soviet newspapers published articles about the heroic struggle of the Varsovians. However, real aid was minimal. Long-range aviation made several sorties, dropping weapons and ammunition over the city. But without parachutes, these cargoes often crashed to the ground or fell into German hands. Special mention should be made of the 1st Polish Army of General Zygmunt Berling, formed in the USSR. In mid-September, several of its battalions crossed the Vistula and tried to entrench themselves in the Cherniakow area to link up with the rebels. This attempt, undertaken without proper preparation and support, ended tragically. Of the 2,000 soldiers who crossed to the western bank, only a few hundred returned. The rest died or were captured. By the end of September, when it became evident that the uprising was doomed, the Soviet position softened. Aviation increased the supply of weapons and food. Artillery began shelling German positions. But it was already too late. The fate of the uprising had been decided. When the first shots of the uprising rang out in Warsaw, the Western Allies found themselves facing a complex dilemma. London and Washington watched with admiration the heroism of the Poles, but real opportunities for assistance were extremely limited. Warsaw's geographical location made it almost unreachable for Allied aviation. 2,800 kilometers round trip from the nearest airfields in Italy, at the limit of flight range even for the best bombers of that time. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, upon receiving news of the uprising's beginning, immediately convened an emergency meeting of the War Cabinet. The British leader, always sympathetic to the Polish cause, insisted on maximum support. However, the chiefs of staff presented discouraging calculations. Flights over German-controlled territory without fighter cover meant the loss of up to 30% of aircraft in each sortie. Despite this, British and South African crews from a special squadron began risky night flights. Volunteer pilots, many of whom were Poles serving in the Royal Air Force, dropped containers with weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies. Each such flight became a feat: night navigation, constant anti-aircraft fire, the need to accurately pinpoint insurgent positions in a city engulfed in flames. The Americans proposed a more ambitious operation: daylight bombing raids using B-17 flying fortresses. But this required permission from the Soviet Union to land at airfields in the Poltava area after completing the mission. Stalin categorically refused, citing that the uprising was a reckless adventure, not coordinated with Soviet command. A tragic symbol of Western aid was the operation on August 14th, when 129 American bombers dropped containers with supplies for the insurgents. Without precise coordinates and under heavy anti-aircraft fire, most of the cargo fell into German hands. Those that reached insurgent positions primarily contained food and medical supplies, but heavy weaponry was catastrophically lacking. At the headquarters of the Home Army, the results of air deliveries were tallied with bitterness. Throughout the entire uprising, the Western Allies conducted about 200 sorties, losing 41 aircraft. 130 tons of cargo were dropped, of which no more than 60 reached the insurgents. For comparison, the daily consumption of ammunition in just one area of the Old Town was about 2 tons. Political support also proved limited. Churchill repeatedly appealed to Stalin with requests to help the insurgents, but received evasive answers. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, concerned with maintaining good relations with the USSR in anticipation of decisive battles with Japan, adopted a cautious stance, limiting himself to diplomatic statements. When the roar of battles became an everyday occurrence, Varsovians learned to survive in a city transformed into a battlefield. Amidst the whistle of bullets and the explosions of shells, a special form of civil society was born, a society under siege. Every basement of an apartment building became a small world where dozens and sometimes hundreds of people shared meager supplies of water and food, supporting each other during the terrifying hours of bombardments. From the very first days of the uprising, the insurgent administration created an extensive network of civilian services. In each liberated district, commandants were appointed from among respected residents who were not involved in combat operations. They were responsible for distributing food, organizing shelters, and evacuating people from dangerous areas. A true miracle of organization were the field hospitals. Operating rooms were set up in basements, on the first floors of sturdy buildings, and in former shops. Medics performed the impossible. With a severe shortage of medicines, without electricity, sometimes by candlelight, they carried out complex operations. Surgeon Stefania Kuzmitska, who led a hospital in the Old Town, performed over 200 operations in 3 weeks of August, saving wounded fighters and civilians. For children caught in the combat zone, special shelters were created. In the Joliborge district, Ursuline nuns organized an orphanage where over 300 children found refuge, many of whom had lost their parents. Here, despite the proximity of the front, impromptu lessons were held, games were organized, and puppet shows were staged, all to give the children a sense of normal life, even if only for a short time. Water supply became one of the most acute problems of the besieged city. After the Germans bombed the city's pumping station, residents were left without water. A frantic search for alternative sources began. Wells were dug in parks and squares, often under fire. Long queues formed for water, and every trip with buckets could cost a life. The issue of food was no less acute. In the first days of the uprising, insurgents captured several German food warehouses, which allowed for the establishment of a public catering system. Field kitchens operated in every district, where hot meals were distributed once a day. Portions were meager, a plate of soup and a piece of bread, but this allowed people to maintain their strength. By September, supplies were exhausted, and the diet was reduced to 200 grams of bread per day. Amazingly, cultural life continued in besieged Warsaw. Literary evenings were held in basements, where young poets read poems about struggle and freedom. Artists drew posters and caricatures of the Germans, raising the morale of the residents. In the Śródmieście district, an impromptu theater even operated, staging patriotic plays. The insurgent press played a special role. More than 10 newspapers and bulletins were published daily. The most popular was Informacyjny Bulletin, Information Bulletin, the official organ of the Home Army, with a circulation of up to 5,000 copies. Newspapers were printed in underground printing houses on any available paper, from wallpaper to German forms. The radio station Błyskawica, Lightning, became the voice of fighting Warsaw. Several times a day, news about the front lines, reports from the battlefields, and appeals from the command were broadcast. Radio broadcasts raised the spirits of the citizens and let the outside world know that Warsaw continued to fight. The price of this struggle was terrible. By the end of September, approximately 150,000 civilians had died as a result of combat operations, mass executions, and bombardments. Entire families disappeared under the ruins of houses, became victims of punitive operations, or died from wounds due to lack of medical care. For those who survived the uprising, the psychological consequences proved no less severe than the physical ones. Children who witnessed the death of loved ones, the destruction of their homes, and the cruelty of the occupiers carried these traumatic memories for life. Many survivors suffered for decades from what would now be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, panic attacks, depression. Warsaw fought not only with weapons, it fought with its daily life, its refusal to surrender, its ability to maintain humanity in inhuman conditions. And this, perhaps, was its greatest victory. September of '44 was a month of bitter revelations for insurgent Warsaw. After the initial successes and euphoria of August, a turning point arrived, slow and agonizing, like the agony of a mortally wounded man. On September 12th, the old town fell, the heart of the Polish capital. Thousands of Home Army fighters and civilians were forced to retreat through sewer collectors into the central districts. Those who could not escape fell into the hands of Dirlewanger's executioners. Żoliborz, the northern district of Warsaw, held on with its last strength. The commander of the defense, Lieutenant Colonel Mieczysław Niedzielski-Rzepecki, recorded in his diary, "In Czerniaków, where Polish units of General Berling tried to link up with the insurgents, a real tragedy unfolded. The Germans, having transferred fresh units, cut off the landing from the river and systematically annihilated it." The commander of the _1_ insurgent battalion, Major Adam Boris, reported to headquarters via radio, _2_. By the 20th of September, it became definitively clear there would be no substantial external support. Soviet troops, entrenched on the right bank of the Vistula, made no attempts to cross the river. Western allies limited themselves to symbolic air deliveries, most of which fell into German hands. The psychological state of the insurgents and the civilian population deteriorated rapidly. While in August the city was dominated by a spirit of optimism and faith in victory, September brought apathy and despair. Tadeusz Bor-Komorowski, a doctor at one of the insurgent hospitals, wrote in his memoirs, quote, "3. In this atmosphere of hopelessness, the Home Army Command decided to begin negotiations with the Germans. On September 28th, in the Joliborge area, the first meeting between representatives of the insurgents and officers from Bach-Zelewski's staff took place. The Germans put forward harsh conditions: complete surrender, handing over all weapons, and the departure of the civilian population from the city. The only concession was the recognition of Home Army fighters as combatants, entitled to prisoner of war status under the Geneva Convention. Fierce debates unfolded at the insurgent headquarters on Mokotovska Street. General Tadeusz Komorowski insisted on continuing the fight. "We swore to fight to the end." Colonel Antoni Kruszczal, commander of forces in the central districts, objected. "Every day of fighting costs the lives of hundreds of civilians. We have no right to sacrifice them." On October 2nd, 1944, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in the building of the former Karol Borchardt factory in the Joliborge district, General Tadeusz Komorowski signed the Act of Capitulation. The document, drafted in German and Polish, contained 8 points defining the fate of the insurgents and the civilian population. The Polish commander's signature was firm, but the hand holding the pen trembled noticeably. The decision to capitulate was incredibly difficult for the command of the Home Army. 2 days prior, fierce disputes erupted at an emergency staff meeting. Colonel Kazimierz Irenek Osmecki, head of intelligence, presented disheartening data. Ammunition will run out in 3 days. Food will last for a week. There are no medicines. There are over 10,000 wounded in hospitals for whom we cannot provide proper care. The terms of capitulation turned out to be unexpectedly acceptable. The German command, under pressure from international public opinion, agreed to recognize the participants of the uprising as combatants with prisoner of war rights according to the Geneva Convention. This was a crucial achievement. Home Army soldiers avoided execution and received POW status. The civilian population was subject to evacuation from the city with the right to take personal belongings. The ceremony of surrendering weapons took place in Polytechnic Square. Home Army soldiers, many with tears in their eyes, piled rifles, pistols, and grenades into huge heaps. Young signalwoman Janina Kowalska recalled, "I couldn't part with my pistol. It was all I had left." The commander noticed my hesitation and quietly said, "Yasya, the war is not over for us. It's just entering another phase." The evacuation of the civilian population began immediately after the signing of the capitulation. Long columns of people with bundles and suitcases stretched towards the assembly points. German soldiers, who just yesterday had mercilessly shelled these same streets, now maintained order in the queues. In total, about 500,000 people were evacuated from Warsaw and sent to a transit camp in Pruszków. From there, some were sent to forced labor in Germany. Others were distributed throughout occupied Poland. The fate of the insurgents varied. Home Army officers, including General Komorowski, were sent to an Oflag, a prisoner of war camp for officers in Langwasser. Rank-and-file soldiers ended up in Stalags, camps for enlisted personnel. Female combatants, of whom there were about 5,000 in the Home Army, were sent to the women's sections of the Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen camps. Despite their POW status, the conditions of detention were harsh, especially in the last months of the war. Some insurgents managed to avoid capture. They mixed with the streams of civilians or escaped through sewer collectors even before the capitulation. These fighters continued underground activities in the occupied territories or made their way to units of the Polish army fighting alongside the Red Army. After the evacuation of the population, Warsaw turned into a ghost city. By Hitler's order, special teams systematically destroyed surviving buildings. Historical monuments were blown up, Libraries and museums were set on fire. A German engineer who participated in these actions wrote in his diary, "We are not just destroying a city, we are erasing the memory of a people, its soul. This is the most terrible crime of all that I have had to participate in." By the time Warsaw was liberated by Soviet troops in January 1945, the city was 85% destroyed. Of some districts, only piles of bricks and twisted metal remained. But even in these ruins, life flickered. The first Varsovians returned to their city, beginning the long road of its reconstruction. The capitulation was the end of a battle, but not the end of the struggle. Many participants of the uprising who survived captivity and concentration camps continued their resistance after the war, now against the new regime that came from the East. Others, disillusioned and exhausted, chose emigration, carrying with them the memory of 63 days of free Warsaw. The Warsaw Uprising was not merely a military event. It became a cornerstone of Polish national identity. The heroism and tragedy of those 63 days forever changed Polish identity, becoming a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the people in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. For Poles, the battle for Warsaw is a national epic, comparable to the Iliad for the Greeks or the Song of Roland for the French. After the war, the communist authorities tried to consign the uprising to oblivion. Mentions of it disappeared from history textbooks, and its participants were persecuted. But the memory of the uprising was preserved in families, passed down from generation to generation. Every year on August 1st at 5 in the evening, the hour the uprising began, all of Warsaw freezes. Sirens sound, traffic stops, people on the streets stand motionless, paying tribute to those who fought for the city's freedom. In modern Poland, the uprising has become a symbol of national identity, uniting society regardless of political views. The Museum of the Warsaw Uprising, opened in 2004, is visited annually by hundreds of thousands of people. Young Poles wear T-shirts with insurgent symbols, and graffiti depicting the anchor, the emblem of the Home Army, can be seen on the walls of houses across the country. But not only Poles have learned lessons from this tragic page of history. Military specialists from various countries meticulously studied the experience of urban combat in Warsaw, drawing important tactical and strategic conclusions from it. For the Soviet Union, the lessons of the Warsaw Uprising became especially valuable. The Red Army, which subsequently faced the necessity of storming Berlin, Königsberg, and other cities, carefully analyzed the tactics of German troops in suppressing urban resistance. Of particular interest were methods of combating barricades, techniques for clearing multi-story buildings, and the coordination of infantry and armored vehicle actions in narrow streets. The memory of the Warsaw Uprising lives on and transforms in the modern world, acquiring new forms and meanings. In independent Poland, these events became the foundation of national identity, uniting various political forces. Every year on August 1st, at precisely 5 o'clock in the evening, the entire country falls silent for a minute. Cars stop, pedestrians freeze on sidewalks, sirens sound. Poland pays tribute to the heroes of the 63 days of freedom. The Warsaw Uprising Museum, opened in 2004 for the 60th anniversary of the events, has become one of the most visited in the country. Its interactive exhibits immerse visitors in the atmosphere of the fighting city. Here, one can hear the voices of the participants, walk through reconstructed streets and underground communications, and see authentic documents and rebel weapons. Particularly striking is the wall with thousands of photographs of the fallen, from gray-haired veterans to teenage messengers. Cinema and literature continue to reflect on this tragic page of history. The film Zero by director Jan Komasa shocked audiences with its realistic portrayal of urban battles. Miroslav Krzyżanowski's novel Canal became a bestseller, telling the story of love between two young rebels against the backdrop of apocalyptic events. In music, painting, sculpture, images and symbols of the uprising are present everywhere. The symbol Polski Walczący, fighting Poland, an anchor formed by the superposition of the letters P and W, has become one of the most recognizable graphic symbols in the country. It can be seen on youth clothing, in graffiti on city walls, and in the logos of patriotic organizations. For the new generation of Poles, the uprising is not just a historical event, but a living connection to the past, a source of national pride. Scientific discussions about the uprising continue to this day. Historians debate the expediency of its beginning, the role of the Soviet command, and the political calculations of the Western Allies. The opening of archives after the fall of the communist regime allowed for a new perspective on many aspects of those events. Particularly sharp debates are sparked by the question of whether the Red Army could have come to the aid of the insurgents in August 1944. The international significance of the Warsaw Uprising extends far beyond Polish history. Military academies in various countries study it as a classic example of urban warfare under conditions of enemy superiority in manpower and equipment. The tactics of the insurgents in using underground communications, methods of creating multi-level defensive positions, and the organization of medical assistance under siege, all of this has become part of training programs. Germany has learned its lessons from these events. Modern German historians and politicians acknowledge the tragic guilt of the Nazi regime for the destruction of Warsaw and the mass executions of civilians. A separate section is dedicated to the Warsaw Uprising in the Berlin Memorial to the victims of war and tyranny. German school children study these events as an example of crimes against humanity. Russia for a long time treated the uprising ambiguously. Soviet historiography presented it as an adventure of the London government, doomed to failure. Modern Russian historians try to give a more objective assessment, acknowledging both the heroism of the insurgents and the complexity of the strategic decisions of the Soviet command in the summer of 1944. In modern international relations, the memory of the uprising continues to play an important role. For Poland, these events have become a symbol of the striving for independence and sovereignty. In relations with neighbors, especially with Russia and Germany, the historical memory of the uprising often becomes a factor influencing diplomatic decisions. The Warsaw Uprising is not just an episode of World War II, it is a lesson in resilience and self-sacrifice, relevant to all humanity. In a world where conflicts and contradictions are once again escalating, the history of 63 Days of Freedom reminds us of the price that must be paid for independence, and that even in the most hopeless situations, the human spirit is capable of resisting evil.